The icy wind howled across the Delaware River like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the desperate hopes of a dying revolution. General George Washington stood at the river bank, his weathered face etched with the weight of impending defeat, watching as chunks of ice drifted downstream like fragments of his crumbling army's morale. It was December 25th, 1776, and the Continental Army was bleeding to death not from British bullets, but from desertion, disease, and despair. The men huddled around meager fires, their bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow, their enlistments set to expire with the dying year. Washington knew that if he didn't act soon, the American Revolution would end not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of soldiers walking home. The situation had become increasingly dire throughout the autumn months. After a series of devastating defeats in New York, Washington's forces had retreated across New Jersey. In what many called the retreat to the Delaware, the British, under General William Howe, had pushed the Continental Army to the very edge of Pennsylvania. Confident that winter would finish what their cannons had started, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, barely 21, but already displaying the sharp intellect that would later make him legendary, approached his commander with the latest intelligence reports. "Sir, our scouts report that Colonel Johann Rahl's Hessian garrison at Trenton remains confident in their winter quarters," Hamilton reported, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "They believe no army would dare march in such weather." Washington's eyes gleamed with something that might have been madness or genius, perhaps both. The Hessians, German mercenaries fighting for King George III, had settled into Trenton with the comfortable assumption that warfare ceased during winter's grip. They had underestimated both the desperation of the American cause and the cunning of their enemy. The plan forming in Washington's mind was audacious to the point of insanity. He would use the very weather that was destroying his army as a weapon against his enemies. The howling wind, the driving snow, the treacherous ice all would become allies in a gambit that would either save the revolution or ensure its spectacular failure. As Washington surveyed his ragged troops, he saw men who had already sacrificed everything for an idea that seemed increasingly hollow. Thomas Paine's words from the crisis echoed in his mind. "These are the times that try men's souls." The pamphlet had been read aloud to the troops just days before, and its message of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds had stirred something deep within the ranks. The general's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hanson Harrison, stood nearby, studying the river's treacherous currents. "The ice is thickening, sir," he observed. "By tonight, crossing will be nearly impossible for conventional forces." Washington nodded grimly. Nearly impossible, but not entirely so. The Hessians would never expect an attack in such conditions, which made those very conditions his greatest advantage. As the snow began to fall more heavily, Washington made his decision. He would stake everything on a single throw of the dice, using nature itself as his secret weapon. The die was cast, and the fate of a nation would be decided by men willing to march through hell itself, or in this case, through the frozen hell of a Delaware winter. By the afternoon of December 25th, the weather had transformed from merely harsh to absolutely brutal. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, and the wind drove sleet and snow horizontally across the landscape with such force that visibility dropped to mere yards for most armies. Such conditions would have men seeking shelter and waiting for better weather. For Washington, they represented opportunity. The Continental Army had been secretly preparing for this moment for days. Under cover of darkness and driving snow, Washington had been moving his forces into position along the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. The main crossing point would be at McConkey's Ferry, roughly 9 miles north of Trenton, where the river was narrower and the current less treacherous. General Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's most trusted commanders, had been tasked with organizing the logistics of what many considered an impossible undertaking. "The men are asking questions, sir," Greene reported to Washington as they huddled in a commandeered farmhouse. "They want to know why we're preparing boats in such weather." Washington's response was characteristically measured. "Tell them we're going to give the enemy a Christmas gift they'll never forget." The general's calm demeanor masked the enormous risk he was taking. Military historians would later note that this operation violated nearly every principle of conventional warfare. But Washington understood that conventional tactics had brought him nothing but defeat, according to historical records preserved in the National Archives. Washington's force consisted of approximately 2,400 men, divided into 3 main columns. The largest group, under Washington's personal command, would cross at McConkey's Ferry. A second group under General James Ewing would cross directly opposite Trenton, while a third force under Colonel John Cadwalader would cross further south to prevent Hessian reinforcements from arriving. The boats requisitioned for the crossing were primarily Durham boats, long, narrow vessels typically used for hauling iron or along the Delaware. These craft, some stretching up to 60 feet in length, were designed for heavy cargo and could theoretically handle the weight of men, horses, and artillery. However, they had never been tested under such extreme conditions. Captain Alexander Hamilton supervised the loading of the artillery pieces, including the precious cannons that would prove crucial in the coming battle. "The ice is making the loading treacherous," Hamilton observed, watching as soldiers struggled to maneuver the heavy guns across the slippery river bank. "One false step, and we'll lose everything to the river." As evening approached, the storm intensified rather than abated. The wind howled with such ferocity that spoken orders were lost in the gale, forcing officers to rely on hand signals and physical contact to communicate. The driving snow reduced visibility to almost nothing, creating conditions that would have been impossible for most military operations. But Washington had calculated that these same conditions would work in his favor. The Hessians, comfortable in their winter quarters in Trenton, would never expect an attack in such weather. Their sentries would be seeking shelter rather than maintaining vigilant watch, and the sound of the approaching army would be masked by the howling wind. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners, experienced fishermen from Massachusetts, had been given the critical task of managing the boats during the crossing. These men, accustomed to the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, were perhaps the only soldiers in the Continental Army with the skills necessary to navigate the ice-choked Delaware under such conditions. As the sun set behind the storm clouds, casting the landscape into premature darkness, Washington gave the order to begin. The fate of the American Revolution now hung in the balance, dependent on the courage of men willing to face both the enemy and the fury of nature itself. The operation began at 6 o'clock in the evening, just as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the wall of storm clouds. The scene at McConkey's Ferry resembled something from Danny's vision of the frozen hellmen, struggling against howling winds, ice-covered boats grinding against each other in the churning water, and the constant threat of death by drowning or freezing. Washington himself was among the first to enter the boats, understanding that his personal presence would be crucial to maintaining morale. During the treacherous crossing, as he stepped into the lead Durham boat, the ice cracked ominously beneath his feet, and the vessel lurched in the powerful current. The general's trademark composure never wavered, even as spray from the river began to freeze on his greatcoat. Colonel John Glover's mariners worked with practiced efficiency, using long poles to push away chunks of ice that threatened to hold the boats or trap them mid-river. These men, weathered by years of Atlantic storms, understood that the Delaware presented unique challenges. The river was narrower than the ocean, which meant the current was more concentrated, and the ice created obstacles that could shift without warning. The crossing that Washington had optimistically planned to complete in a few hours stretched on through the night. Each boat could carry only a limited number of men, meaning multiple trips were necessary to transport the entire force. The horses proved particularly problematic, as the frightened animals struggled against their handlers, threatening to overturn the already unstable vessels. According to contemporary accounts found in the Library of Congress collections, the most dangerous moment came when a massive ice floe, driven by the current, struck the boat carrying several artillery pieces. The impact threw two soldiers into the frigid water, where they would have certainly drowned had not Captain Hamilton and several mariners managed to pull them to safety. The incident served as a stark reminder of how quickly the operation could turn from daring gamble to complete disaster. Private John Greenwood, whose journal would later provide historians with invaluable first-hand accounts of the crossing, described the scene. "The wind was so fierce that it seemed to cut through our very souls, and the ice made such a terrible grinding sound against the boats that we feared each moment would be our last. Yet the general stood tall in the bow, steady as a rock, and his courage gave us strength." As the hours passed, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the conditions worsened as the temperature continued to drop. The men's wet clothes began to freeze solid, creating a crackling sound when they moved. Frostbite became a real concern, and several soldiers had to be helped from the boats due to exposure. The artillery pieces presented the greatest challenge. The cannons, essential to Washington's battle plan, were enormously heavy and difficult to maneuver under the best conditions. Loading them onto the boats required the coordinated effort of dozens of men, and keeping them stable during the crossing demanded constant attention. Captain Hamilton personally supervised each piece, understanding that losing even one gun could doom the entire operation. By midnight, roughly half the force had successfully crossed, but Washington faced a terrible decision. The original plan called for the attack to begin before dawn, but the crossing was taking much longer than anticipated. He could abort the mission and retreat to Pennsylvania, or he could push forward with whatever forces he had available. True to his nature, Washington chose to press on. The ice-covered men who had successfully crossed huddled on the New Jersey shore, trying to maintain some semblance of military order, while their comrades continued the dangerous journey across the Delaware. Many were beginning to suffer from hypothermia, their movements becoming sluggish and their speech slurred. Yet they remained, bound by loyalty to their commander and faith in the cause that had brought them to this desperate moment. As the final boats prepared to make the crossing, Washington knew that there could be no retreat. The die had been cast, and the fate of American independence now rested in the hands of men who had already proven their willingness to face death itself for the sake of liberty. By 3 o'clock in the morning on December 26th, the last of Washington's force had finally reached the New Jersey shore. The crossing had taken 9 hours, 3 times longer than planned, but somehow, miraculously, not a single man had been lost to the river. However, the real test lay ahead, a 9-mile march through the storm to reach Trenton before the Hessians could mount an effective defense. The men who assembled on the river bank bore little resemblance to a professional army. Ice hung from their muskets like crystalline decorations. Their uniforms were soaked through and beginning to freeze solid, and many had lost feeling in their extremities. Yet something remarkable had occurred during the crossing. The shared ordeal had forged these disparate soldiers into a brotherhood bound by common suffering and mutual dependence. General Nathanael Greene took command of the right column, which would approach Trenton from the north, while General John Sullivan led the left column along the river road. Washington himself would accompany Greene's force, positioning himself where he could best observe and respond to developments during the battle. The march began in darkness so complete that soldiers could barely see the man in front of them. The storm continued to rage with undiminished fury, and the road, if it could be called that, was a treacherous mixture of ice, snow, and frozen mud. Men slipped and fell constantly, their weapons clattering against the ground as they struggled to maintain footing. Private Joseph White, whose memoir would later be published by the Smithsonian Institution, wrote, "We marched like ghosts through that frozen wasteland, our breath forming clouds that were immediately swept away by the wind. The sound of our footsteps was muffled by the snow, and the only other noise was the occasional curse when someone fell or the creak of leather. As we moved, the cold was becoming a more dangerous enemy than the Hessians. Several men began showing signs of severe frostbite, their fingers turning white and losing sensation. The officers made the difficult decision to leave some of the most severely affected soldiers at farmhouses along the route, hoping that civilian families would provide the care needed to save their lives. Artillery Captain Alexander Hamilton rode alongside the cannon crews, ensuring that the precious guns kept moving despite the treacherous conditions. The horses struggled terribly in the deep snow, and several times the artillery pieces had to be manhandled through particularly difficult sections of the route. Hamilton later wrote that the cannons left a trail through the snow that resembled a great serpent writhing its way through the frozen landscape. As dawn approached, the storm began to show signs of weakening, though the snow continued to fall steadily. Washington consulted his pocket watch, a gift from his late brother Lawrence, and realized that they were running dangerously behind schedule. The original plan had called for the attack to begin before sunrise, but it was now clear that they would be assaulting Trenton in broad daylight. This development was both a blessing and a curse. Daylight would make coordination easier and reduce the risk of the Continental forces firing on each other in the confusion of battle. However, it would also give the Hessians better visibility to organize their defense and potentially escape if the attack began to falter. The first sign that they were approaching Trenton came when the advance scouts reported seeing smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. The Hessians, warm and comfortable in their winter quarters, had no idea that an enemy force was approaching through the storm. Their sentries had long since sought shelter, and the noise of the approaching army was masked by the howling wind. Washington, called his senior officers together for a final conference. As they crested a hill overlooking the town, through the driving snow, they could see the outlines of buildings and the faint glow of windows. Trenton lay before them, seemingly peaceful and unaware of the danger approaching from the north. "Gentlemen," Washington said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "we have come this far through hell itself. Now we must finish what we started. The fate of our cause, indeed, the fate of liberty itself, depends on what we do in the next." The general's words were met with determined nods from his officers. They had all risked everything to reach this moment, and there could be no turning back now. The frozen march was nearly over, and the battle for American independence was about to begin. At 8 o'clock in the morning, as the first pale light of dawn struggled through the storm clouds, the Continental Army reached the outskirts of Trenton. The town lay before them like a sleeping giant, its streets empty except for the occasional Hessian sentry who had quickly retreated indoors to escape the brutal weather. Washington's gamble was about to be put to the ultimate test. The general positioned himself on a small hill overlooking the town, where he could observe the deployment of his forces. Greene's column had successfully approached from the north, while Sullivan's men had reached their assigned positions along the river road. The artillery, despite the hellish journey through the storm, had arrived intact and ready for action. Captain Hamilton supervised the placement of the cannons at the head of King Street and Queen Street, the two main thoroughfares that dominated Trenton's layout. These guns would be crucial to the battle's success, as they could control the streets and prevent the Hessians from forming organized defensive lines. The bronze barrels gleamed with ice, and the gunners had to work quickly to clear their weapons before the action began. Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, had spent Christmas night celebrating with his officers, confident that no enemy would dare attack in such weather. The professional soldiers under his command were seasoned veterans of European warfare, but they had grown complacent during their comfortable winter quarters. The idea that the ragged Continental Army might launch a surprise attack in the middle of a blizzard seemed preposterous. The first indication that something was wrong came when the Hessian sentry reported seeing figures moving through the snow near the northern edge of town. However, the visibility was so poor that the report was initially dismissed as a case of nervous imagination. By the time the truth became apparent, it was too late for the defenders to mount an effective response. Washington gave the signal to attack, and the morning air was suddenly filled with the thunder of American artillery. Hamilton's cannons roared to life, sending iron shot crashing through the windows of buildings where Hessian soldiers were scrambling to reach their weapons. The sound echoed off the walls of the town like the voice of an angry god, and the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, stumbled from their quarters in various states of undress. Many had been drinking the night before and were still suffering from the effects of their Christmas celebrations. The combination of surprise, confusion, and the continuing storm created a perfect recipe for military disaster. Private John Greenwood, fighting with Greene's column, later wrote, "The enemy ran about like chickens with their heads cut off, some trying to form ranks in the street, others attempting to flee toward the river. Our muskets spoke with deadly authority, and the snow was soon stained red with the blood of those who had thought themselves safe." Colonel Rall, despite his initial confusion, attempted to rally his men and organize a counterattack. The Hessian commander was a brave soldier who had fought with distinction in European campaigns, but he had never faced an enemy who would dare to attack in such impossible conditions. His troops, accustomed to the formal warfare of European battlefields, were unprepared for the savage intensity of the American assault. The battle raged through the streets of Trenton with a fury that matched the storm itself. The Continental soldiers, their suffering during the crossing and march transformed into righteous anger, fought with a desperation born of knowing that defeat would mean the end of their cause. They had endured too much to fail now. Captain Hamilton's artillery continued to dominate the battlefield, the cannons repositioned as needed to support the infantry advance. The young officer displayed the same brilliance under fire that would later make him famous as a statesman, coordinating the guns with deadly precision and ensuring that the Hessians could not establish any defensive positions. As the battle progressed, it became clear that the Continental Army had achieved complete tactical surprise. The Hessians, despite their professional training and superior equipment, were unable to cope with the combination of weather, surprise, and American determination. Many began to surrender rather than continue a hopeless fight, while others attempted to flee across the frozen countryside. the thunder of liberation had sounded in Trenton, and the course of American history was about to change forever. The battle for Trenton reached its climax within the first hour of fighting, as the disorganized Hessian defense crumbled under the relentless pressure of the Continental assault. Colonel Rahl, mortally wounded while attempting to rally his men, fell from his horse in the town square, his blood mixing with the snow that continued to fall steadily. The sight of their commander's collapse broke the last vestiges of organized resistance. Among the German mercenaries, Washington, observing the battle from his command position, could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The same army that had been retreating in defeat just weeks earlier was now executing a flawless tactical victory against professional European soldiers. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and the general understood that he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in military history. The Hessians who had not been killed or wounded began surrendering in large numbers, their white flags appearing throughout the town like flowers blooming in the snow. Captain Hamilton, his artillery having done its deadly work, now turned his attention to organizing the prisoners and securing the captured supplies. The young officer's energy seemed inexhaustible, even after the ordeal of the crossing and march. Private Joseph White, exhausted but exhilarated by the victory, wrote in his journal, "We had done the impossible. We had crossed the Delaware in the worst storm any of us had ever seen, marched 9 miles through frozen hell, and defeated an army of professional soldiers." The men were laughing and crying at the same time, hardly able to believe that we had actually won. The captured supplies proved to be a godsend for the Continental Army. The Hessians had been well provisioned for the winter, with warehouses full of food, ammunition, and winter clothing. For soldiers who had been surviving on short rations and wearing rags, these supplies represented the difference between life and death. Washington immediately ordered the distribution of warm clothing and hot food to his men. Perhaps more importantly, the victory at Trenton captured numerous artillery pieces that would prove invaluable in future engagements. The Continental Army had been desperately short of cannons, and the 18 guns taken from the Hessians more than doubled Washington's artillery strength. These weapons would play crucial roles in subsequent battles throughout the war. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond the military significance. Word of the impossible triumph spread rapidly throughout the colonies, rekindling hope in a cause that many had considered lost. The pamphlets and newspapers that carried the story described Washington's crossing of the Delaware as an act of divine providence, proof that God himself supported the American cause. General Greene, surveying the battlefield as the last pockets of resistance were eliminated, marveled at the transformation he had witnessed. These men were ready to desert just days ago. He commented to Washington, "Now they fight like lions. What we have accomplished here will be remembered for generations." The victory also had immediate practical consequences for the Continental Army. The success at Trenton convinced many soldiers, whose enlistments were due to expire, to extend their service. The promise of bonuses and the boost to morale provided by the victory helped Washington retain a core of experienced soldiers who would form the backbone of his forces in the campaigns to come. As the day wore on and the storm finally began to clear, Washington faced another crucial decision. The British would certainly respond to the loss of Trenton, probably with overwhelming force. The general could either retreat back across the Delaware with his victory intact, or he could remain in New Jersey and continue the offensive. Characteristically, Washington chose the bolder course. The decision to remain in New Jersey and continue fighting would lead to additional victories and ultimately transform the entire strategic situation in the war. But for now, as the Continental soldiers settled into their captured quarters and enjoyed their first hot meal in days, they could savor the knowledge that they had achieved something truly extraordinary. The frozen march to Trenton had ended in complete victory, and the American Revolution had been reborn in the fires of battle and the crucible of winter storm. As evening fell on December 26, 1776, the Continental Army settled into the captured town of Trenton, their impossible victory complete. The storm that had been Washington's greatest ally was finally beginning to subside, leaving behind a landscape transformed by both weather and war. The streets that had run red with blood were now covered by a pristine blanket of snow, as if nature itself was attempting to conceal the magnitude of what had occurred. Washington established his headquarters in the same building where Colonel Rahl had planned his Christmas celebration just 24 hours earlier. The irony was not lost on the American commander. who found among the German officers' papers detailed intelligence about British dispositions. Throughout New Jersey, the documents revealed that the enemy had been completely confident in their winter quarters, never imagining that any force would dare to attack in such conditions. The prisoners taken at Trenton numbered over 900 men, including officers who had served with distinction in European campaigns. These professional soldiers, accustomed to the formal warfare of the Old World, struggled to comprehend how they had been defeated by what they had dismissed as a rabble of colonial farmers and tradesmen. The answer lay not in tactics or equipment, but in something far more profound: the transformative power of desperate courage. Guided by inspired leadership, Captain Hamilton, exhausted but energized by the victory, worked through the night cataloging the captured supplies and preparing reports for Congress. The young officer understood that the political implications of the victory were as important as the military ones. The Continental Congress, meeting in Baltimore after fleeing Philadelphia, had been on the verge of negotiating a peace settlement with Great Britain. The victory at Trenton would change everything. The impact of Washington's triumph rippled outward from Trenton like stones thrown into still water. Throughout New Jersey, loyalists who had been preparing to welcome British rule found themselves reconsidering their positions. Patriots who had been hiding in cellars and attics emerged to rejoin the cause, their faith in American independence restored by the seemingly impossible victory. Private John Greenwood, reflecting on the events of the past day, wrote, "We had proven that Americans could fight and win against the best soldiers in the world. More than that, we had proven that no obstacle, not weather, not fear, not even the certainty of defeat could stop men who were fighting for their freedom." The crossing of the Delaware had been more than a military operation. It had been a statement of who we were and what we could become. The victory at Trenton was followed by another success at Princeton a few days later. As Washington continued his winter offensive, these twin victories transformed the strategic situation in the war, forcing the British to abandon most of their positions in New Jersey and retreat to New York. The initiative that had been lost during the disastrous autumn campaign was suddenly regained, and the American cause was revitalized. The story of the crossing became legend even before the war ended. Artists and writers seized upon the dramatic elements of the tale: the desperate general, the impossible weather, the dawn attack through the storm. Emanuel Lloyd's famous painting, created decades later, would capture the popular imagination and ensure that Washington's crossing of the Delaware became one of the most recognizable images in American history. Military historians have continued to study the Trenton campaign for over 2 centuries, analyzing Washington's use of weather as a weapon and his ability to transform a retreating army into a victorious force. The operation violated numerous principles of conventional warfare, yet it succeeded brilliantly because Washington understood something that his enemies did not: that men fighting for their freedom could accomplish the impossible. The legacy of that frozen march extends far beyond military history. The Continental soldiers who crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, proved that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when united by a common cause and inspired by visionary leadership. Their willingness to face death itself for the sake of liberty established a tradition that would echo through American history in moments of crisis and challenge. As Washington looked out over the snow-covered town of Trenton on that December evening, he could not have known that he had just saved the American Revolution. He could not have foreseen that his desperate gamble would be remembered as one of the most brilliant military operations in history, or that the story of the crossing would inspire generations of Americans facing their own seemingly impossible challenges. What he did know was that his ragged army had proven something fundamental about the American character: that there were no limits to what free people could accomplish. When they refused to accept defeat, the frozen march to Trenton had ended in victory, and the United States of America had taken a crucial step toward its destiny as the land of the free and the home of the brave.